Welcome to Crime Most French, a weekly podcast taking you through intriguing cases carried out on French soil. Researched and narrated by Cedric and rudely interrupted by me, Melanie. We're the True Crime Podcast on the Lions. Crack open le vin and let the mayhem commence.
This week's episode takes us to the 15th century, that's as far back as we've ever gone. On the 26th of October 1440, Gilles de Rais is executed by hanging and burning in Nantes, in the west of France. He's accused of having tortured and killed up to 200 children and an unknown number of adults. So who was he? Why was he famous?
Sounds like a bit of a monster.
Yes, he is known in the legend as a monster, yes. In fact, his life merges with fictional characters as well.
Okay.
So it's a bit difficult sometimes to know exactly what was true and what was invented.
So he's turned into a bit of a legend.
Yes. So Gilles de Rais, or Rais, as we should say today, R-E-T-Z, because that's the name of the area, he was rich. He was very, very rich. He's issued from a number of noble families, and he's involved in the succession to the Duchy of Brittany. In the 15th century, Brittany was not part of France. In fact, France was a very small amount of territory, mostly between Paris and the Massif Central also. Mm-hmm. Because Brittany was an independent duchy. The north was part of the Netherlands. The southwest, what is now Nouvelle-Aquitaine, is nearly exactly the same territory that was Aquitaine under English rule. Mm-hmm. The southeast was also independent duchies and counties and whatever.
Yeah.
So it was a very small place at the time.
So would this have been around about the same time as Eleanor of Aquitaine?
No, that would have been not later. That would have been at the same time as the 100 Years' War.
Oh, okay.
In fact, it was nearly right in the middle. Mm-hmm. We'll see. We're going to talk about that a bit later. During the 14th century, the 100 Years' War century, essentially, the Duchy of Brittany is coveted by two families, the Montfort, traditionally allied with the English, and the Penthièvre, traditionally allied with the King of France. Mm-hmm. There's a 26-year war between these two families, and eventually the Montfort house obtains the crown in Brittany.
So, I mean, Alsace and Lorraine has often changed to have been Germanic and then being French. So I guess Brittany's kind of like the other end of the extreme, where sometimes it was English and sometimes it was French.
It was never English.
Oh, okay.
It's always been independent.
And probably still, many people still think it is.
Yes. But one of the two families fighting for it used to traditionally side with the English.
Okay.
Because the English had territory in what's called Anjou now, which is east of Brittany, but very close to Brittany, in addition to their territories in the southwest.
Okay.
So that family traditionally tended to side with the English.
Right.
But it's always been independent. Okay. It's always been independent until it became French. And some people would like it to be independent again. Mm-hmm. So the head of the house, or the Montfort house, becomes the Duke of Brittany under the name Jean IV of Brittany. Mm-hmm. His aim from that point on is to keep Brittany independent and keep the French kings at arm's length, because the French kings want Brittany. Mm. So they're trying all they can. But there are so many difficult and complex succession rules that there is a good claim by the English king to become the Duke of Brittany as well.
Okay. Is it because it's strategically it's in quite a strong place, because obviously it's kind of like almost like a peninsula, it's jutting out into the channel and...
Possibly, but also it's quite big and rich. Mm. So the two kingdoms around it want it. Okay. That's the main reason, really. Mm-hmm. It would be a good territory to add to your country, especially for the English, because then they would have territories going all the way from Brittany to Spain.
All the way, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that
all
would
the way
be
down.
A massive chunk of France. Mm. In 1371, the Rais house dies. The last head of the family dies without any succession. He was called Gerard V Chabot. And Chabot is a very common name. My parents have neighbors called Chabot in Vendée. It's a very common name in Vendée. Mm-hmm. I didn't know it was from Brittany, but it's a common name in Vendée. Jeanne Chabot inherits the fortune and the territories. She is, as far as I remember, a cousin or a distant cousin of Gerard V. So she ends up having territories covering a good chunk of Brittany, maybe a third of Brittany, a good chunk of Vendée, and a bit of Poitou all the way to Angoulême.
Oh, right. Okay, so almost down.
We're talking massive territories. That's a very, very big amount of territory.
So that's almost down by us.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah. They would have had territories not far from here. Actually, there was a castle maybe half an hour's drive north from here that they owned. The main one, the most famous castle, was Machecoul, which is legendary. Everybody has heard of the castle of Machecoul. It was a very big, very fortified, and very well-placed castle. Mm-hmm. And that was in the Rais family. So they essentially controlled one of the few accesses to Brittany. Mm-hmm. So they could control who goes into Brittany and possibly make people pay taxes and whatever. I haven't heard of taxes being paid, but I didn't look for it. No. But I suspect something was happening there.
I think even more with castles than any other property, it's location, isn't it?
Yes. So when the family dies, obviously, the Duke of Brittany wanted those territories because then he would have owned more than the King of France. Of course, the King of France, which is Charles V, doesn't want the Duchy of Brittany to fall into the hands of the English.
No.
Obviously. So he appoints Guy de Montmorency Laval as a kind of legal guardian for the territory. So it's still technically owned by Jeanne Chabot, but she doesn't control it. Okay. It's Guy de Montmorency Laval that does. Jean IV of Brittany, still trying to get those territory, imprisons Jeanne Chabot. Okay. He wants her to sign away her territories and her fortunes to him.
Was there any justification why she was locked away, or was it just because he was a monarchy and he could just do what he wanted?
Well, yes, exactly. He was an absolute ruler of most of Brittany, so he could do, if you were in his territory, he could do whatever he wanted. Mm-hmm. But she's a tough woman because she's in prison for several years and always refuses to sign anything away to him.
Good for her.
Yes. She starts legal proceedings as well in Brittany, and she even ends up running court cases in Paris because the highest court in the land was the Paris court. Mm-hmm. But yeah, she tries to defend herself, even though she's imprisoned, against him because she doesn't want to sign away her inheritance. On the 1st of November 1399, Jean IV of Brittany dies. Jeanne has no descendants, so she agrees to have Guy de Montmorency Laval as the person who inherits formally the territories and the fortune of the family.
Well, he's been running it anyway. So.
He's been running it for a few years at that point, yes. There's one condition, is that he takes the Rais name and the Rais coat of arms. Okay. Because it's her family and she wanted him to be a Rais instead of a Montmorency Laval. Mm-hmm. But she changes her mind.
Typical woman.
She designated instead Jean de Cran, which is written C-R-A-O-N.
And not easy to say after 5 pints.
No, it's Jean de Cran anyway, as her successor. Okay. And that, of course, triggers a long battle to know who really should inherit that fortune. And that lasts a few years. But the two families don't get along anymore. No,
not surprisingly.
Yeah, but they come to a compromise by having Guy de Montfort Laval marry Jean de Cran's daughter.
Okay, yeah, well, that was quite common. Marrying your family not for love, but purely for power reasons.
Yes, especially daughters.
Yes.
In 1404, Jeanne Chabot gives 4 estates to Guy Laval in exchange for a pension. So essentially, she gives away some of her territories in exchange for an old age pension, so that she doesn't
keep
have to deal
quiet.
with that crap. Yeah. Guy takes the title of Lord of Rais, and he moves into the Machecoul Castle with his wife, Marie. And in 1407, Jeanne dies. So Gilles de Rais, we're coming to him, is the son of Guy Laval and Marie de Cran. Okay. So he therefore inherits the vast domains of the Montfort-Laval/Chabot family, but also the Cran family territories, which are also massive, slightly more to the east. Okay. At that point, his combined families control most of the west of France. Not the southwest, but the west.
Everything from kind of like Aquitaine up.
Everything north of Aquitaine essentially is somehow related to his family, yeah.
So for those who don't know, Aquitaine is the estuary on the Atlantic coast is where Bordeaux is, and so everything from south of there is Aquitaine. How far north above the estuary does would Aquitaine have gone at that point?
It would have gone all the way to Anjou by small bits. Okay. So it would have.
It wasn't one entire clump like it is now.
In the north, not completely new, not at that point. Okay. Eventually, under I don't know which English king, it becomes a whole territory that goes all the way from Angers to the Spanish border. But I don't think in 1404 it was the case yet.
No.
They developed it slightly. I really can't remember the name of the king. That would be after Eleanor of Aquitaine. Because Eleanor of Aquitaine only had Aquitaine and has stopped in Poitou, where we are here.
Yes.
That was inherited in part by Henry II Plantagenet, as far as I remember, who had some of the Anjou as well. So they kind of nearly connected the two territories to create something a lot bigger. So that's what it was at the time.
Okay. Getting a real history lesson here.
It was this one, yes, because you have to put the story in context to understand what's going on. So Gilles de Rais might be born in 1405 in a bedroom in the Black Tower of the Tifauge Castle.
Oh, okay. That sounds really ominous.
That's Game of Thrones territory.
Yeah, that's, you don't want to be, I think there's also a really bad make of wine that's a Riesling that's called Black Tower, which is ghastly.
Okay. We don't really know because there's no trace of his birth, but we know from legal documents that he's 14 or 15 in 1422. Okay. That's how we roughly know when he was born. We definitely know where, but we don't necessarily know exactly when. He has a younger brother called René, who was born in 1414. This one we're sure. After his mother Marie dies at an unknown date, because women are not that important.
Of course not.
And their father dies in 1415. They are brought up by their grandfather, Jean Grand. His decision to bring them up, even though he wasn't the closest relative, was partially motivated by the fact that his son, who was called Amaury, died in Agincourt in 1415, so the same year. So he decides to replace his son by his two grandsons. Essentially, that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, still power building.
Yeah. He himself dies in 1432. At that point, Gilles inherits everything because he's the eldest son.
Yeah.
He gives some of his territories away to his brother.
To René.
He acquires the lordship of the Suze, which becomes handy a lot later in the story.
Okay.
Because he shouldn't have inherited anything being the youngest brother.
Being the second son,
Yeah, but he will use it as a power base later. And that becomes the name of the younger branch of the family. The younger branch of the Rais family is the Suze family.
I'm presuming the family would want to distance themselves from Gilles after the court case.
Yes, we're getting there.
It's like, there's not many Hitlers out there, is there, really?
Yeah. So some attempts have made to wed the two brothers to various noble families in Brittany and Normandy, but they all fail. Eventually, Gilles gets engaged to his cousin, Catherine de Thouars.
Oh, haul out the banjos.
Yep. The engagement has a few problems, though. First of all, they are fourth degree cousin.
Oh, fourth degree.
It's not too bad.
No, for back then, we're relative strangers.
I'm not even sure they needed to request permission from the bishop to get married at fourth degree. I know third, yes, you would need a permission. Fourth, I'm not even sure they needed to, but anyway. So that's one of the problems.
Yeah.
And also the two families have lots of legal battles at the moment because they fight for the same territories or related territories.
Yeah.
So they don't get along very well, so they don't want that marriage to happen. Ignoring all the issues, Gilles finds a good solution. He kidnaps his future wife and he marries her outside the church, in the chapel, in one of his castles, and doesn't publish bans, so nobody can know about it until it's too late.
Well, it's always handy when you own your own church.
Yeah. Despite the fact that there was a contract made at the time, the church says that the marriage is void and incestuous, so it didn't happen.
Yeah. Well, even now you have to register your banns.
Well, yeah, we had to even do it in Scotland.
Yes, we had to put an announcement in the French embassy.
Yeah. So in 1422, after the death of Catherine's father, the church legitimizes the wedding between Gilles and Catherine.
Okay.
He takes control of even more territories, in northern Poitou mainly, because he then gets his hands on the Viscounts of Thouars family's territories.
So we'll be talking kind of like round about Poitiers.
We're talking, yes, between Poitiers and the coast.
Okay.
Roughly. So there will be some in West Nord de Sèvres, some in West Nord Vienne, and it goes all the way to possibly Tours.
Okay, well. So that's quite
far. It's big territories. Yeah. Nothing compared to his, obviously.
No.
But it's still a nice addition to his stuff. So he's making his territory grow quite fast, and it's becoming huge.
Yeah, because Poitiers was, it's a very old city.
Yes. Well, that was where Joan of Arc died,
Mm-hmm.
in a convent in Poitiers.
Mm-hmm. If you ever are lucky enough to come and visit France, I would definitely recommend a stop in at Poitiers, nice city.
Gilles and Catherine have one daughter.
Mm-hmm.
She was born in 1433 or 34, I'm not completely sure. Through all these kidnappings and imprisonments and marriages, the Caen and the Rais families managed to get their hands on the castle of Tiffauges and Pouzauges, which are two very, very good places to own when you want to control territories. And they come back in the story quite a lot. But Gilles and Jean, so Gilles and his grandfather, are really two evil bastards. Because they stop at nothing. They don't mind kidnapping, killing, imprisoning, whatever. They will get what they want.
It's power and absolute power, is it?
Yeah. Well, they're so rich that they're just untouchable. There's nothing you can do. You can't even go and say, send the police force was at the time, because they have their own armies. Yeah. And there's just nothing you can do against them. So they do whatever they want.
If you have your own army and your own church and your own castle, you're set.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when you have relatives in big families, like in duchies and related territories. It's just nobody will want to touch you anyway, because they know even if they have a bigger army than yours, other families would join you against them. Yeah, they're untouchable. Yeah, they're just going to crush you. Yeah. Between 1422 and 1423, the Pontief family, remember, who fought the Montfort for the Duchy of Brittany, they managed to ally themselves to a number of families around Brittany. They've decided to fight back against Jean V of Brittany, who inherited the duchy from his dad, John IV. The war runs for about 2 years, and eventually the Pontief lose again. They lose many territories and castles, and John V keeps the Duchy of Brittany. But to thank the Caen and the Rais families, they get some of the Pontief territories. Okay, even more. Even more. Wow. At the death of his grandfather, Gilles finds himself at the head of one of the largest fortunes in the country. He's probably not far behind the Duke of Brittany in terms of territory and money. Okay. It's very hard to know exactly how much he had. He probably didn't even know himself, mainly because the calculations of all of his incomes are so difficult to understand, because there were lots of ancient rules and lots of exceptions for everybody. Essentially, it was a rule per person. It was impossible to know how much money he had and how much money he was getting on a regular basis. But we're talking insane amounts of money. He would have been a billionaire now, a multi-billionaire most likely. Yeah, but when you're not taxing at the source, then it's very difficult to know how much money he was actually taking in off of. Yes. Plus, he was also paying tributes to others. Like, for example, he was paying tributes on his territory in Brittany to the Duke of Brittany. He had no choice. Yeah. See, his other territories were on the French side, so he was paying tributes to the French king as well. It's extremely difficult to know exactly how much money he had. Yeah. Not something we suffer from, and not something most of us suffer from. Yeah. Some historians have tried to calculate, and they think that he owned at least 100 parishes, something like that. Wow, that's a lot. So it's 100 towns. Yeah, that would have taken in a lot of taxes. Yeah. So now we're starting the second part of his life. When he was young, from the age of 15 or so, he was really interested in war. He was a good knight. He was doing the job. He didn't mind actually going into battle. He was into war. He liked it. So it reminds me of Henry VIII. He was he was younger. He was really into. But Henry VIII liked the games more than the actual war. Whereas, the tournaments were. Yes, the tournaments. But Gilles de Rais liked the actual war. He liked to go and kill people. That was his thing. So as a knight of the French crown, he was taking part in wars, and he had no problem with that. So would he have been a chevalier then? Yes, he would have been a knight, yes. So in 1422, following the war between France and England, which at that point becomes quite intense, we're entering the second phase of the 100 Years' War. The Duchy of Brittany, through all its alliance and its geographical location, of course, hovers between the two crowns. Yeah. Jean V does quite a good job trying to keep Brittany independent and kind of appeasing both sides. He's still using them for the battles. But the Caen and Rais families move closer and closer to the French crown at that point.
Okay.
Eventually, the Duchy of Brittany completely sides with the English. They decide that's the winning side.
Okay.
And it's true that at the time, you have Agincourt in 1415,
Mm-hmm.
you have a few fairly big battles that are lost by the French side, and it doesn't look good at that point. Yes. So he sides with the French king,
Mm-hmm.
and possibly because of the fact that the Duke of Brittany sided with the English.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he takes part in many battles, and he himself takes a number of cities that were controlled by the English.
Mm-hmm.
And what's kind of weird is that he had agreed with the English that he would not kill the garrisons in the city he takes, and he doesn't kill the English soldiers, but he kills everybody who speaks French, because as far as concerned, they're collaborators.
Okay.
So everybody who speaks French in
So-
those cities he takes, they're dead, and there's no exceptions.
Mm.
Women, kids, men, everybody dies.
Wow. Always good to be bilingual even then.
Yeah. So eventually he raises a decent army,
Mm-hmm.
and he moves towards Blois, where a force is being assembled to rescue Orléans, which is besieged by the English and has been for a number of years now. That's the same time Joan of Arc is also moving towards Orléans, and after having been questioned by the clergy in Chinon and in Poitiers to establish if she's really sent by God,
Mm-hmm.
she's allowed to join those forces. So that small army that Ray has raised on the 27th of April 1429 meets Joan of Arc in Blois, getting ready to rescue Orléans.
Is it really bad that I suddenly thought, ooh, she was in Chinon, I wonder if she picked up that's a really good place for Loire wine.
Yeah. So the siege of Orléans is lifted
Mm-hmm.
because of that small army.
Yeah.
And it's Jeanne who announces the news to Charles VII
Mm-hmm.
of France. She then convinces Charles VII to go to Reims and be crowned King of France.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't at that point. Then Gilles takes part in later campaigns, which is called the Loire campaign. So essentially they go down the river and take all the castles on the way.
That's a lot of castles.
Yes.
Even now there are still, if you're ever wanting to pick up a cheap chateau, Loire is the place to look.
Yeah. So he takes part in that
Mhm.
and has lots of fun. In July 1429, at the coronation of Charles VII in Reims, Gilles and 3 other lords are charged to deliver all the sacred relics. There's a scepter, there's a sword, there's whatever it is. So he's one of 4 lords who have the privilege of actually delivering required things to the king to be crowned king.
Okay.
So he's quite high up the hierarchy at that moment.
So he's rubbing shoulders with...
Yeah. And as a reward, the king makes him Marshal of France.
Okay.
So it's essentially the highest distinction you can possibly get.
Yeah.
There's only a few in the country at a time.
With hindsight, I wonder if he regretted doing that.
No, the king has always kept him at a certain distance because he's the king. It's just...
He has the same infallibilities as people.
Yeah, he doesn't have friends. So he knows Gilles, most likely. He has probably talked to him. Historians don't say how often, but he has probably talked to him, but that's about it. He's a tool as far as the French king is.
Yes, a political tool rather than just being, as in the modern parlance, a tool.
He's a tool to get to his end. So
Yes.
he's a tool to get an army, he's a tool to
yes,
get money, he's a tool to run campaigns against the English.
But with hindsight, he's clearly a monster. I was just wondering whether the king thought.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I don't know what the mentality was at the time.
No.
So he is one of the reasons why Gilles is eventually caught and tried.
Okay.
I guess you can say that eventually he saw that it was a mistake, but I'm not even convinced he thought it was a mistake. He just saw it was an outlaw and he needed to get rid of him.
A means to an end. And,
I don't think they had really this kind of thinking. He
No.
was a king. He had one thing to do.
And that was it. Once it was done, he didn't think about it again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he also takes part in very famous battles, like, for example, the Siege of Paris, and again with Jeanne of Arc.
Mm-hmm. A different siege of Paris than the one we were talking about last week. Yes,
because it was controlled by the English, so they had to free Paris at the time.
Mm.
He's allowed to add the fleur-de-lis to his coat of arms, which is
so
also very high privilege.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's a very big deal. Not many people are allowed to do that. The only person who got it that same year was Joan of Arc, and that was it.
Mm.
So 2 people in the whole kingdom were allowed to add further list to their coats of arms that year. He continues to fight for the French king for a few years.
Okay.
But eventually, Joan of Arc dies. Remember,
a sudden and warm death.
Slow cooked death, I guess. So she was captured by the English, tried in Rouen, and then burnt. And in 1434, even though he's requested by the king to help the defense of the city of Grancey, he doesn't move a finger, so doesn't do anything.
Okay.
Most likely it's because at that point he has run out of money. So even though he was one of the richest people in the country,
he was spending it quicker than he was.
Well, he was financing wars, so that cost a lot of money. You need to raise armies.
Yeah, of course. So you have to feed them. You have to clothe them.
You have to pay your soldiers.
Yeah,
and all
make
that.
the armaments and stuff.
You have to arm them, and so it costs a massive amount of money. And it's thought that at the time he just gives up because he can't afford it anymore. So the king summons him and threatens to take away his titles.
Okay.
Even worse than that, he's accused by his descendants in the 1450s, 1460s to have wasted his money on unnecessary things. For example, protocol. So he had nice dresses and stuff in feasts and parties and other frivolities. So not only he lost his money at war, he also lost his money having fun at home. But after Joan of Arc dies, he mostly retires from the war life. And lives in some of his castles and doesn't really take part in anything anymore. In 1434, he sells some of his territories to various buyers, including Jeanne of Brittany, who still wants his territories. So he buys everything he can buy. But his descendants managed to convince the king to stop him from doing that. So he's, at that point, put under control from the crown to stop him from selling his territories, especially to the Duke of Brittany.
Yeah, the other side.
Yeah. So even those that he has already sold, the tribunal in Paris says, no, that didn't happen.
No.
So at that point, he lives on his own, between lots of air quotes. He lives away from public life in his castles. Now we're getting to the crime part of his life.
Well, so we're going to go from his legitimate murdering to his illegitimate murdering.
Yes. Yes. So we'll see that he has committed a number of what's considered crimes at the time, and it goes all the way from renouncing sales to murder to what's called crime de lèse-majesté, so it's a crime under the king, which can cover nearly everything the king doesn't like, so it doesn't really matter what you've done, but it's considered a crime against the king, and therefore usually you're arrested. The triggering point, that is an obvious triggering point, is in 1439, he gives a place called Saint-Étienne-de-Mer-Morte to his brother, René.
Yeah, is that the one you mentioned? Or was that one of the ones you mentioned earlier?
No, it's not later. At that point, they're adults. He's in his late 20s.
Okay.
No, he just gives it to him. I don't know why.
Okay. But
he changes his mind anyway, and he takes it back by force. So essentially, he sends his army and takes it back. Then he sells it to Geoffroy Le Ferron, who's very closely linked to Jeanne of Brittany. He's a cleric who has, at the time, because the state and church were not separate, when you're a cleric, you also have secular responsibilities. So he's a cleric, but he's also responsible for the justice system in Brittany, or the Duke. But Gilles takes it back again, and he sells it to one of his neighbors. But Jean Le Ferron, at that point, stops the sale legally. So for revenge, Gilles organizes an ambush on the 15th or 16th of May 1440 with 50 or 60 armed men. So he goes to that town and he enters the church with all his weapons and his men, and he threatens to kill the cleric. He tells him, you have to come out with us or we're going to kill you here. So they come out, he follows them. Part of the town had a castle. So the cleric who owns the castle at that point, because he managed to keep the sale valid, he gets them in the castle and they imprison him in that castle. So at that point, Gilles is kind of collecting his enemies because he's now done illegal dealings. He's attacked the Duke of Brittany through his cleric. Yeah. And he's also alienating the church because he's attacked a cleric inside the church, which you don't do.
Big no-no, yeah.
And he imprisoned that guy as well.
Yeah.
So now he has the Duke, the church, and the legal system against him.
Yeah.
So Jean V of Brittany sentences him to give back that town or pay 50,000 gold coins. And in response, Gilles takes Jean Le Ferron, the cleric, to his castle of Tifauges, which is outside Brittany and outside Jean V's influence.
Okay.
It's on the French side of his territories. So Jean V can't do anything at that point. So the church gets pissed off.
Yeah.
So they open a special secret inquiry called Inquisitor Infamiae, which is very, very strange. Its purpose is to collect information about the reputation of a person based on rumors. So they go around the land and they ask people, what do you think of that dude? Do you know what he's done? And they collect all that, and that's their inquiry.
It's just like the Inquisition.
It's like the Inquisition, but it's not based on anything. It's not based on religion. It's not based on a specific crime. They just collect rumors. That's what they do.
They're just collecting the dirt on you.
Yeah, exactly. They collect dirt. That's all they do. That is done, and the bishop in charge, who's called Jean Malestroit, tries to dig a bit deeper and find out what the truth is, because he's heard some very disturbing stories about Gilles. One of them is that loads of children have disappeared from around his castles. So he wants to know, is it really true? Or is just people making things up?
Sounds like the French version of the Pied Piper of Hamelin.
Mm-hmm. So on 29th of July 1440, the results of the inquiry are published, and Gilles de Rais is accused of the rumor of rape and murder of children, as well as having taken part into demonic injunctions, vocations.
Do you think he played Dungeons and Dragons as well?
Could have been, yeah. Maybe that's what it was.
So, I mean, there was a moment in time in history in the 1980s that if that was it, if you played Dungeons and Dragons, if you had that D12 or the D20 in your hand, that was it. You were just worshipping Satan.
What's interesting is at the same time as that church inquiry was running, there's a secular inquiry starting as well.
Okay.
That is mainly because of Jean V of Brittany. He wants to establish really what's going on. And he's not so much interested in the church part of things. But that means that now against Gilles, there are two trials,
inquiries.
Two inquiries starting. At that point, they don't have Gilles yet, obviously, because he's living in these castles with a small army. So Jean V of Brittany, who can't go to those territories because he doesn't own them, strikes a deal with one of his brothers, called Arthur de Richemont, who is on the side of the French king. And in exchange of some of Gilles de Rais' territories, which Jean V doesn't own, but he gives them to one of his brothers in exchange for him to go and get Gilles wherever he is. He does, and they take the castle of Tifauges where Gilles was hiding, and they free, of course, the cleric who was still imprisoned there, and they take Gilles and bring him to the trial in Nantes. So the 13th of September 1440, he's called to appear in front of the clerical tribunal in Nantes for murder of children, sodomy, invocation of demons, offense against divine majesty, and heresy. That's a long list.
Yeah, that's a long list. He must have been busy.
He must have been, yes. On the 15th of September 1440, he's arrested in the castle of Machecoul as well, because at that point he was kind of arrested but at home and told you have to appear in Nantes, but he didn't.
So he had the ankle bracelet on. He wasn't allowed to leave his castle.
Yeah, the equivalent of the time, but he didn't, so they go and get him to his other castle.
Oh, right, okay.
And at that point, he's properly arrested with two of his servants and two accomplices. At that point, they're just alleged accomplices.
Yeah.
They're called Gilles de Sillé and Roger de Bricqueville. But the two accomplices go on the run. So it's really just Gilles and two servants that are arrested. So he's imprisoned in Nantes at that point. They don't want him to get away again.
No, okay.
It's no longer, please come to the trial. Now you're in jail.
Yeah, you will come.
And you stay there until we're done.
You will be accompanied by two large chaps who'll keep you on the straight and narrow.
So on top of the religious trial, he appears in front of the secular trial, which is controlled by Jean V. We'll see that, in fact, Jean V controlled both trials because his main guy is in charge of the church dealings in the area. And he also owns the dude who does the secular stuff. So It is presented as two trials, one secular, one religious, but it's really John V's trial against Gilles, and it does it two ways.
So you don't have that separation of church and state?
No, there's no separation whatsoever. No, because the king is the direct descendant of God and this kind of stuff. So. So there's no separation. But in this case, the Duke controls both systems.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't look good for Gilles having a...
Yeah. And as far as a secular trial is concerned, he must answer accusations of murder and also the coup in Saint-Étienne de Mer-Morte against the church and the sale there. They're more interested in... at that point, they're more interested in the financial and legal aspect of things. The records that have been found show that he answers his accusation against the coup, but there's no mention of the murders. So it's difficult to know if it's just dropped because there's no proof really, or if it's just lost. The records have been lost, but there's no trace of that. We don't know what he says to these accusations. On the 18th of September, the two trials start, and...
Are they running simultaneously?
Yes, they're running simultaneously, and they're listening to the same witnesses. So there's a number of parents, the number varying between 10 and 30 or so, who are heard both by the church tribunal and the secular tribunal about the murders at that point. That's mainly under the action of the secular judge, I guess we're calling him a judge, who appears to really try to understand what's been happening and if really there's been murders of children. So it doesn't really care about the rest, all the accusations of calling the demons and whatever.
He's more
he's getting interested in the murder of the children, and he travels on location to talk to the people and ask for more information and stuff. So he's really trying to find out what happened. The fact that there's two trials for the same thing going on at the same time, one religious, one secular, is fairly unusual, but it's justified by the fact that some of what he's done is considered a crime against the king, and because the king is the descendant of God, it's also a crime against God, and therefore let's have two trials. Okay. That's how they justify having both at the same time, because it's fairly unusual. Normally you've done something against God or you've done something against the legal system, but not both at the same time.
But not both at the same time.
So that's how they justify it. In the end, there's about 10 parents that are kept as witnesses.
Okay.
So the others are not judged that credible, but these ones are considered very credible. So they testify for both tribunals separately at the start. First, Gilles tries to defend himself by dismissing the judges. He tries to show that the judges are not justifying what they're doing, but the judge's answer is, you didn't do the request in writing, therefore it's invalid.
Okay.
That's the level of pettiness of the tribunal at that point. Then he refuses the accusations. He says he's a good Christian. And at some point, what's strange is that the prosecutor at some point says that he swears to say the truth and only the truth and whatever.
Yeah.
And he asks Gilles to do the same, and Gilles refuses. So then he's threatened with excommunication, and still Gilles refuses to swear to say the truth. And that goes on for a little while. Then, a few days later, on the 11th of October, the judges dismiss Gilles, and he's told to come back 2 days later because they want to talk to their parents again. Both tribunals are now talking to the parents again.
Okay.
On the 13th, he reappears in front of the court. Of course, he can't go anywhere. He's in jail.
Yeah.
And at that point, they combine the two trials. Because what's the point of continuing to pretend it's two different things?
Yeah, so they condense it down to one trial. Yeah. Makes more sense.
And he's accused of 49 crimes.
That's a lot.
Especially when one of them is to have killed 200 children. That's only one of the 49. So it's a very, very long list.
Yeah, wow.
Gilles refuses them and insults the judge. And as a result, he's excommunicated.
Oh, God. I guess at that point, you really don't have anything to lose, do you? Because those are not going to be, well, you've been bad, let's give you a suspended sentence.
They're very big crimes.
Yeah, this is going to end up in you not being in one piece in the end, so being excommunicated at that point is really small potatoes.
It was a big thing because they all believed in God, and being excommunicated means that not only God doesn't like you anymore, but also you won't even be buried in the church.
Yeah, you won't for unconsecrated ground.
So it's a fairly big thing. Well, being excommunicated in the 14th or 15th century is a big thing.
Well, yes, I guess so. I'm forgetting the time difference, yeah.
So on the 15th of October, the proceedings start again, but something has changed. Gilles recognizes the legitimacy of the trial and the judges. He accepts that he committed the crimes he's accused of, and crying, asks for forgiveness of the religious judges who he insulted 2 days earlier. The judges accept his apology. During his first confession, which takes place on the 21st of October, so because he's now said, oh, I've done all those things, we're starting over. So now he's being heard and his confession is being recorded and all that. He repeats his confession on the 21st and he adds a few details to, I guess, to make it more believable. And again, on the 22nd, so the next day, he repeats that confession in front of the tribunal. That change is very strange because from someone who's been all his life above the law, who didn't need to fear anyone because he could do anything he wanted, and if somebody wasn't happy, they could just be killed. From one day to the next, switching from I didn't do that, I don't recognize your court, to yes, I've done all those things, please forgive me, is very, very strange. As far as I can tell, one of the possible reasons is that 2 of the priests that were arrested around his place and around the same time, called Blanchet and Prelati, have confessed, obviously under torture, because that's how you do things at the time. Yes. It's not a nice interrogation like now with water and food. It's proper torture.
Yeah, with water, but waterboarding rather than...
waterboarding would have been nice at the time. They had much worse systems.
So basically these priests' confessions are obviously entirely valid because they've been tortured.
Yes. They confess to practicing alchemy because they were trying to find the philosopher's stone. Yes. As you do at the time.
Yeah.
Prelati also confesses to having called a demon called Baron in the presence of Gilles, which is very important.
And that's important.
It's not like they did it around the area in the next village. They did it when he was there, and that's how they make it a demon or satanistic trial.
Okay.
Because they have said they have done that. They have said he was there. They didn't say he asked for it, but he was there.
Okay.
And therefore, he's an accomplice of summoning demons or whatever it is exactly they're accused of. So at that point, the 2 servants who were arrested at the same time as Gilles, remember, who are called Henri and Poitou, they describe in minute details how Gilles tortured and killed children. So they're also tortured. And they describe, I've read some of the transcripts, they're very, very detailed about what Gilles would have done to those kids.
Oh dear.
It's really a to-the-second account of whatever he decided to do to those kids. So he would cut their heads at some point at the end, but before that he would cut their fingers and whatever. They describe in minute details everything he's supposed to have done to those kids.
Wow, that's blood-curdling.
Yes. And the trial now has a lot of material because not only they have testimony from parents whose kids have disappeared, they have confessions from 2 priests who say he's been involved in alchemy and summoning demons. And now they have confessions of 2 of his servants saying that, yes, he did abduct and torture and kill kids, and this is how he's done it.
Wow.
At that point, we have a very classical system of accusations, which was apparently fairly common at the time, which has 3 parts. One is rebellion. So you're always accused of rebellion. And in this case, it is having attacked the system by having renounced sales and this kind of stuff.
Okay.
Invocation of the devil. So it's the attack against God.
Yeah.
And also acts against nature. So we're talking sodomy and stuff that was done to kids. Apparently, it was a very well-oiled system of accusations that was used at the time.
So it's a trifecta of...
Yeah. If you were accused of these 3 things and they could show they had proof of them, you were toast.
Then that was tatties.
That was tatties.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if half of them were mythical, like summoning demons.
Yes, yeah.
How can you prove you've been summoning demons? They don't exist. But he was accused of, people have confessed that he did. That's it.
That was enough.
Yeah. So he's sentenced on the 25th of October, so it goes quite fast at that point.
Wow, yeah.
He's sentenced by the clerical tribunal. He's then led to a different castle where he hears the decision of the secular tribunal. So they still, at that point, pretend again that it's 2 different tribunals.
It's 2 different trials. So
they just happen to be run by the same people. Doesn't matter.
So they conglomerated it and then re-untangled it again and then turned it back into two.
When you read the transcripts and the descriptions, it's a bit like they lost that track themselves. So they were pretending it was two different trials, and then they lost track because they were lying about it. So suddenly it became one because it's the same thing. And at the end, because they needed to sentence him the proper way, they just split it again, but based on the same evidence, based on the same witnesses, and based on the same accusations.
So it was all a bit of a kangaroo court.
Yeah, of course it was. It's 15th century justice.
Well, of course.
What do you expect?
Yeah.
And it's all run by a duke, so...
Yes.
Yeah, so he's excommunicated first for being in league with the devil, for vice against nature, against children of both sexes, in a sodomite way.
Okay.
That's the wording in the sentence.
Well, that trips off the tongue easily.
The ecclesiastical tribunal sentences him for 140 murders or more. That's what it says. Or more.
Okay. The 140 wasn't enough.
We're pretty sure there's 140, but we think there's more. We just couldn't be bothered really to list them. The secular court doesn't mention a number at all. He's just sentenced for murder. His two servants and himself are sentenced to be hanged and burnt.
Okay.
Because one thing is not enough. You need to be really, really dead.
Just to make sure. That double tap.
Yeah. The secular judge gives him 3 concessions. On the way to his execution, the families of the victims are allowed to have a procession.
Okay. Is that the equivalent of a witness statement, do you think?
No, it's probably a more forgiving thing.
So the exact opposite of a witness statement.
Yeah, they essentially call to God and forgive him for what he's done. So that's why it's a concession to him, not to them.
Okay, yeah, fair enough.
He will be executed before his servants. That's the second concession. And the third one is he's not going to be completely burnt so that he can be buried on consecrated grounds.
So he's only going to be kind of like quickly flambéed or something then, is he?
I guess, yes. Yeah, lightly burnt.
Yes.
The next morning, on the 26th of October, which was a Wednesday, after a mass, because...
Of course.
The sentences are carried out. So before Gilles de Rais' body is completely destroyed by fire, he's taken out, as promised, and he's buried. There is a monument now built where that happened. They just built it on the other side of the river, Loire, to commemorate what happened on that day. And for a long time, very strangely, it's been a pilgrimage location for pregnant women. Don't ask me why. That makes no sense.
Oh, that is just warped.
Yeah.
Well, I guess he's not here to hurt the unborn child, but yeah, it seems slightly strange. That's like turkeys making a pilgrimage to Bernard Matthews' statue. That is just kind of weird.
Yeah, I know. But it was the case until the 19th century, and then it was destroyed.
Do you think chickens are kind of like deferential to any kind of like images of Colonel Sanders? It just seems that does seem a bit weird.
Yeah, it is weird. So was it guilty or not in the end? There's been debates for centuries about it, and historians and philosophers, including Voltaire, have discussed the reality and probability of all those crimes.
Yeah.
Many of the Lumière philosophers blamed everything on superstition and religion, saying that most of the accusations made no sense. He probably wasn't really guilty. In reality, very few people who debate his case have read the original documents. There are reasons for that. Is that first, the writing is very hard to read. I have read documents from the 16th century from my family, and I just couldn't read it. I had to send it to someone who was an expert in that to translate.
Okay, is it in like an old French?
No, the writing itself is very hard to read.
Oh, not the language, the actual...
In my case, for the 16th century documents, I could easily read the French, but I just couldn't decipher the writing.
Okay.
But in his case, because it's even earlier, not only the writing is very hard to understand, but also the language is very hard to understand. Yeah. Because it's a kind of mix of Middle French and Latin. It's just very
weird.
Strange.
Okay.
So very few people who actually talk about his case have read
the court
so they
transcripts.
Base what they say on what other people have said before, who also haven't read the original document.
So it goes round and round in circles, yes.
So most people who talk about it don't really know what they're talking about. So when you read information about him, it's very important to see who mentioned it, where it comes from, and what they base it on. There's been, for example, even in the 20th century, historians talking about it and saying that it was 800 children that were killed. And that was repeated for like the first 40 years of the 20th century. And then it turns out it was entirely made up by a historian at the end of the 19th century, based on absolutely nothing. He just said, I think it might be up to 800. And then it's repeated by everybody as if it was true.
How on earth would he find time to murder 800
it's
children?
It's only a few years. 800 children would have been like one a day. So that's,
I mean,
that's
that
greedy at that point.
questions would have been asked long before he reached even 400, let alone 800, surely.
Yeah. But at the same time, some people were helping him. There are stories, for example, in the papers from the tribunal of parents that have given their children to him, mainly because he was promising to raise them, train them, and turn them into whatever.
Give them apprenticeships
or,
and
give them a life when they didn't have one or had no chance of doing anything really if they lived there. So there are cases where people knew that he was taking children. The problem is usually they never saw them again. And over time, people started asking questions like, we gave you our son, where is he? And usually they had an answer. Oh, he's gone there for training, or he's gone to Italy to study art, or whatever. And usually people stopped asking questions at that point. Yeah. But that's what the secular tribunal judge was trying to establish. He was trying to establish
how much was true.
Exactly. What really did happen to those kids we knew went with him, and then did that happen to kids that we don't know? Yeah. He took for anything just because they disappeared. Of course, we're talking 15th century. So
how do you keep up with your family once you've moved entirely to a different location?
Yeah, but also the countryside was full of wolves and
So it's very true.
Children disappeared,
and life expectancy isn't the same as it was too.
Yeah, you expect the number of children to die fairly often, but then the numbers started to go up, and that's why people started to ask questions.
So I mean, we can look at the Salem witch trials where they think most of the witches that were on trial were in fact just ordinary women, and it was hysteria, and they were probably innocent. But in this case, there seems to have been some grain of truth of him, children disappearing around about him.
It's difficult to know because proof is a problem.
Well, proof is almost a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, there's been historians, for example, especially in the 19th century, who said that bones had been found in the moats of his castles. But again,
that's probably not that unusual. Yeah,
and that's saying large numbers of human bones, which would have been unusual, but at the same time, it's not mentioned in the trial documents. So you would think they would have known that. Yeah. Also, all the confessions are extracted under torture, so how much credit can give those? Yeah. None, as far as the the modern justice system is concerned. In the way of proof, we have nothing. No. All we have is
some anecdotal evidence.
Some confessions extracted under torture, made up stories.
But a large number of children going missing around about him in his environment.
And we don't really know if it was really a large number. We have no idea. No. It might have been a normal number. Look at the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah, that's very
There
true.
Isn't more boats disappearing in the triangle. It's just a very dense route.
Yes, and it's heavily reported.
Yeah, so in absolute numbers, it's high, but proportional to the traffic, it's perfectly normal. No. So it could also be something like that. We don't know. Mm-hmm. The one thing we know is that when you look at the descriptions of the servants who confessed and said that he had done things to children, we can make a link to today's understanding of the narcissistic psychopath, pedophile, serial killer type of person. Mm-hmm. Because the way they describe the sexual crimes, the way they describe the lack of empathy for the victims, the way they describe his all-powerful murdering attitude, he was really having a really good time at the time when he was doing it, the way he was mutilating and manipulating the corpses. When you put all that together and you compare to recent serial killers, especially pedophile serial killers, he's like typical. Mm-hmm. And
the template.
These servants at the time would have had no knowledge whatsoever of what that was. They had no knowledge of what a serial killer was, or even a pedophile was probably not even a thing at the time. No. So it's kind of suspicious that what they described would now be a typical pedophile serial killer. So
where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Even though it was extracted under torture, what described in details makes sense. So it's hard to know. Also, we know that his childhood has been very disrupted by mainly the death of his father. It's also a fact that he really liked to kill people on the battlefield. He's described as being really enthusiastic.
Okay, so
that's how they describe it.
So very, very bloodthirsty.
Oh, totally. He would go in and kill as many people as you could, and he really enjoyed it. And he was obviously really enjoying it.
So he was a total berserker then.
No, but not really, because berserkers were not really conscious of what they were doing. They were in a trance. He wasn't in a trance. He was just enjoying it. He really had a good time killing people. Also, it appears, but it's difficult to be really sure, that those crimes started after the death of his grandfather, as if his grandfather had it under control and suddenly nobody was controlling it, and therefore he just went and did things that he wouldn't have done before.
So his grandfather was essentially Henry, like Dexter's dad.
Exactly. I was thinking of Dexter when I was reading those descriptions. Yeah. It is essentially that. His grandfather, I don't know if his grandfather was aware of it, if he could channel it, like, for example, sending him to battle instead. And then when he stopped killing people on the battlefield, when he retired after Joan of Arc's death, maybe that's where he turned towards children to satisfy his
bloodlust,
need for kill.
Yeah.
It's difficult. It's very difficult to know. Also, in the 15th century, children were really easy prey. So that could explain why he turned to children instead of...
vulnerable.
Yeah. Again, instead of the local blacksmith or something.
Yeah, yes. Don't never kill a tradesman. They're going to be noticed very quickly when they're not there.
So yes, it is difficult. There are people now in the 20th century trying to show that it's not really true, that it didn't really happen. But really, there are too many things that kind of make sense in the context of what we know today in terms of psychology and history of childhoods and stuff. So I can't say it did happen, but I suspect it did.
Okay. Well, for me, the biggest takeaway and my moral of the story obviously is not going to be about him murdering children. But it's war. What is it good for? Emptying your bank balance.